maybe sort of get real with a little bit of a playbook of actions that we're suggesting to our clients as they're wrestling with a variety of different issues in this unsettled, dynamic, polarized environment. But again, I want to address questions. So as Nancy mentioned, we want to make this interactive. There will be time at the end. We should be able to get to every question. But if someone wants to interrupt along the way, please jump in. I'd like to make this more conversational than a presentation. So with that said, if we could just flip to the second slide, which sort of highlights some of the themes that we're thinking about as we're going into the 2025 proxy season. So the next slide after this. So what are some of the big rock issues as we're thinking about 2025? The first one, and Nancy already sort of alluded to this one, but it's incredibly important. The big institutional investors are very quiet. They've made very few changes to policy. They're being less vocal in terms of their public advocacy and their voting. And they've really pulled back from having a voice on many sustainability topics. And that's really important, and it's very intentional on the part of these big institutional investors. They don't want to get dragged into issues that have become more politicized. So they're pulling back, their voice is not there. So what that has led to is the newer voice in the marketplace, which is this anti-ESG backlash. And it's only gaining momentum. And I think sometimes on issues, you can point to maybe one or two drivers of why something's becoming more significant. Unfortunately, you can't do it in this case. In this case, you have the administration, you have legal challenges, you have regulatory scrutiny, you have anti-ESG investors, you have conservative activists, and they are all pushing, not necessarily in the same direction, but they're pushing, and this anti-ESG backlash is only gaining momentum. And the topic that's really in their sights right now is DE&I, which we'll talk about more in a minute. And then you have the election. And I think the election in a lot of ways has only magnified or amplified or supercharged the direction things were already headed. So I think of it sort of as a train that was moving down the tracks, and this election has only, forced that train to move even faster. So that's a quick sense of some of the themes going into proxy season. If we go to the second slide, we can delve in a little deeper around sort of what that means in terms of some of the issues and topics that are being prioritized. So on slide, I believe it's slide 3, there are sort of 4 groups that we've identified that we think are sort of driving the market right now. If you think of your core institutional investors, so think about Nancy, did you have a question?
Sorry, no, I just noticed that the slide is not advancing for me. So I don't know if it isn't for others. But Teresa, it might be on the sharing side. Sorry, Rob.
Oh, no problem. So let's start with the big institutional investors. So the top shareholders for every company that's on this call, the Vanguards, the BlackRocks, State Streets, T. Rowe, Wellington, Capital Group. These investors are pulling back their advocacy, and they're being a little more careful about how they're talking about a variety of environmental and social topics. And again, that's intentional. Instead, what they're doing is they're pulling back to sort of what I think of as the safety of governance. So they're pulling back to focus on governance topics, which they view as a safe lane. So they're focusing more on topics, board composition, shareholder rights, executive compensation. And again, those are safer topics in this dynamic, polarized environment. if we think about the next group to highlight, which would be the proxy advisors, right? For the work that we do in proxy voting, proxy advisors have a lot of influence, especially ISFs. They can make or break a company's annual meeting. Guess what? They don't want to attract any attention. They don't want to be in the spotlight. So they've made very minimal changes to policy. And again, they're trying to stay out of the spotlight. They do not want to draw the attention of the new administration. So what about pro ESG investors? So think about it broadly as European investors and investors that are really leaning into and have leaned into pro ESG topics over time. They are still there. They're still there in numbers. They're still submitting a significant number of shareholder proposals at companies. In a lot of ways, they are sort of standing their ground and continuing to focus on the issues they've focused on over the last couple of years. I'm not sure that they're going to be able to have as much progress as they've had over the last couple of years, but they are definitely standing their ground and staying in the same position they are. I would argue, though, that their voice, which many of the communication materials that folks like us and folks like you have produced, it was always sort of oriented towards that pro ESG audience. That audience is still there, but there's some new folks in town, and that's anti-ESG. And that anti-ESG voice has continued to grow. It's continued to be more significant. It's continued to get attention. And I think one of the big pivots that's now being made across communication materials is materials need to be thoughtful about both of those groups sort of at the extremes, both the pro ESG folks, but increasingly being mindful of that anti-ESG group as well. Any questions sort of high level on landscape?
Rob,
Okay.
I had a question actually.
Oh, get Nancy.
My question being that, is it possible that because companies don't want to make splashes and those pro sustainability, pro ESG groups are still out there, does that essentially could it give the pro ESG group more leverage for the company to do things for sake of keeping them away from a shareholder proposal, to not putting them to a vote?
So I think I missed the gist of the question. Could you repeat it? I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
I mean, I don't know if I'm being articulate. So I'm curious if the fact that companies don't want to make a big splash and they want to keep steady
Yep.
state, does it give the pro ESG activists more leverage because they're
Leverage.
more likely to
Yeah.
get something done without it going to a vote?
So that's yeah. So it probably should be that way, right?
Mhm.
So if an activist has, they want to see a company make more progress on, say, carbon emissions, right? It probably should be a more rational environment. So they could have a behind closed doors conversation and ideally find middle ground on that specific issue. Unfortunately, we're not seeing it. So we are not seeing the vast majority of issue activists, pro ESG activists, being rational. They're still sort of all or nothing. They're pushing for everything they want in that shareholder proposal, and they are unwilling to sort of find that middle ground with companies. It should work, Nancy, the way that you were suggesting, but it's not been playing out in the situations we've been part of.
Interesting.
And I think the other side of that is, given the environment, I think companies and boards are less willing to come to the table and find that middle ground with an activist, especially an activist that they viewed as being, I'll use the word challenging, maybe over the last 3 to 5 years. So that activist has continued to be a bit of a pain for that company. They've had to spend a lot of time and energy and focus on those specific issues. And now the environment's different, and the company is less willing to negotiate. And they're more willing to say, all right, we'll take this to our shareholders. And if that shareholder proposal gets 25% support. Okay. We're okay with that result. We'll continue with the priorities and the strategy of the company, and we're not going to be knocked off course by something like that.
Okay.
So one of the topics that's definitely moved front and center, I'm sure we've all been following this very closely, has related to DE&I. And in the back half of 2024, it was primarily, hey, what is Robbie Starbuck up to? What companies is he pressuring on social media? And what companies have decided to sort of scale back or pull back or eliminate programs related to DE&I? I think now as we transition in 25, you now have an administration that is laser focused on DE&I as well. So that's a pretty powerful 1-2 punch on DE&I. The third sort of piece of that to round out the trifecta is now the media is involved. You know, this is a good media story. It gets eyeballs, it gets attention. So there's a tremendous amount of focus right now on DE&I. And as we talked about, sort of, Nancy mentioned this and I mentioned it as well, US mainstream investors, they're sort of sitting this one out. So they're being quiet, they're sitting on the sidelines. They don't want to get pulled into this issue that they see as politicized. And I think what that means is that, you know, one of the voices that was very pro DE&I had been advocating for more disclosure around this topic is no longer putting that pressure on companies. So I think what this leads to is an environment where companies need to take a hard look at what they're saying, what they're doing, and making sure they're calibrating their policies and their public communications the right way to sort of align with the priorities and the vision of the organization. And also be comfortable that if they do that work and they reassert what their policy is, that's still going to be the policy if they face criticism. I think that's always sort of a good litmus test, is that if the facts don't change and someone comes out of the woodwork and criticizes a company for something, if that policy changes just based on criticism, maybe that policy is not as foundational as the company really thought it was. So staying with topics and going to the next slide. If we think about climate, obviously everything related to climate has been a huge focus from a sustainability perspective over the last couple of years. And again, remains a really important area for pro ESG activists. We're continuing to see a significant number of shareholder proposals on this topic this year at a variety of our clients, but also across the market. But I think what's happened over the last year is that big investors and also the big banks have decided to pull back from some of these sort of industry-wide, these collaborative efforts to address climate-related issues. When you think about the drivers of why, I think there's legal concerns, I think there's antitrust concerns, but I also think it comes back to they don't want to get caught focused or drawing attention to an issue that is likely to be and has already been something that's become more politicized. I think from a company perspective, what this allows companies to do, though, is move at their own pace. They're not going to get as much pressure from their big institutional investors, especially on this side of the pond, to make more progress. So one thing we always heard from companies in the last couple of years is, well, they're always moving the goalposts on me. You know, we make progress, they say make more progress. We make progress, they say, why wasn't it even more? I think there's less of that that's going to happen in the next couple of years. And this will enable companies to focus on making progress at their own pace and communicating that progress in the ways they want to and not feeling like their hand is forced. So finally, the last slide I wanted to talk about was a bit of a playbook. Playbook might be too strong, but what are some actions that companies could be and should be prioritizing right now? I'll start with shareholder engagement. Though each company, though there are some big investors in the market and they definitely have a lot of influence, the shareholder base and the priorities for every company of their investors is going to be a little bit different. And I think it's incredibly important for companies to have a year-round effort to engage with their fundamental investors, their passive investors, their ESG investors, even their anti-ESG investors, to get a better sense of what their priorities are and what's expected of the companies. As an example, we work with an industrial client. Over the last year, they engaged with over 35 of their top 50 investors. That captured about 72% of their shareholder base. And that enabled them to have a very clear window into what their investors expected from a governance, from a sustainability, and from a shareholder rights perspective. The second body of work we're calling strategic awareness. I'm sure there's a better name for it, but I think the idea here is to take a fresh look at your policies, at your practices, and how you're communicating. Really try to get sort of an outside-in perspective on your company. Are there vulnerabilities? Are there policies and practices that differ than peers? Are there market practices that maybe was an expectation 3 years ago, maybe not as much of an expectation today? So I think it's really, really important to have that strategic awareness and to try to look at it with sort of a fresh set of eyes. The other part of this, and Nancy alluded to this as well, is that the regulatory environment continues to evolve, both in this country, but also just look at what's happening with CSRD in Europe, right? The game is changing. Regulators are going down a certain path in different markets. You think you know what they're doing, now they're going to change course. You have to constantly be aware of those regulatory developments in each and every jurisdiction that matters to your company. And then finally, when it comes to sustainability reporting, I thought I would just note a couple trends that we're seeing across our client base. We work with a variety of companies, primarily mid and large cap companies across industries. And a couple things that have been notable trends over the last month or so. Number one, tighter content in the 10K on topics like human capital. I think in the last couple of years, 10Ks started to do a little bit more. We're seeing our clients tighten up that disclosure significantly. When it comes to ESG or sustainability reporting in the proxy, we're now seeing an intentional move to pull back some of that disclosure. So a little bit tighter in the proxy. When it comes to sustainability reports, we're seeing what I think of as more precision and more focus on the topics that are financially relevant to the long-term success of the business. And then what we're seeing is some of the topics that may not be as financially relevant, they're starting to live in other places, possibly other reports, possibly on the company's website. So sustainability reporting, again, being tightened a little bit. We're also seeing companies invest in their internal controls. I think as we look forward, the expectation is that sustainability reporting should align with the rigor of financial reporting. And I know many companies are taking significant steps to make sure that alignment is there. And then finally, the last trend I would note is, and I never know how to say this the right way, but I think companies are being a little more careful about how they talk about achievements. So if they've made significant progress on something, maybe they're not shouting it from the rooftops. And I also think that they're being very careful that if they're reporting progress, they're ensuring those numbers are as accurate as they possibly can be. I think in the early days of sustainability reporting, numbers may have been a little looser, and I see that those things tightening up significantly more recently. So I think overall, the core message is, focus on those top priorities, focus on reporting your progress, and focus on the things that are most important to the company's success. I think of things from an investor perspective, having been on that side of the table for years. That's what the companies want to see. That's what they want to read in your sustainability reports. And that's what they want to understand from the broader suite of sustainability reporting that a company may publish. So I will stop there. I need to take a breath, but I'd love to hear what questions might be out there among the audience.